The shovel broke through wet earth with a sickening squelch. Daniel's hands trembled as he drove the blade deeper, his breath coming in ragged gasps that formed white clouds in the freezing air. Rain hammered against his back, but he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the grave before him, on the freshly disturbed soil that shouldn't have been disturbed at all. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm coming. Just hold on." The church bell began to toll. Once, twice. Daniel's head snapped up, his heart lurching. It was only 11:55 p.m. The bell never rang before midnight. Never. But there it was, counting out the hours with mechanical precision, each chime seeming to echo from somewhere deep beneath the ground. He looked down at the grave marker. Evelyn Claire Morrison, beloved wife. 1985-2018. The inscription flickered under a flash of lightning, and for just a moment, Daniel could have sworn the dates changed, rearranged themselves into something else entirely. He blinked hard, rain streaming down his face, and the stone returned to normal. Then he heard it. A soft, muffled sound from beneath the earth. Not the settling of soil or the whisper of wind through the cemetery's ancient oaks. This was deliberate, rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. "Daniel." The voice was faint, trembling, suffocated. "It's cold down here. Please don't leave me again." The shovel fell from Daniel's hands. He dropped to his knees, pressing his palms against the wet soil, feeling it shift beneath his weight. His chest heaved with sobs he'd been holding back for 7 years. "I'm here," he choked out. "I'm here, baby. I never left." 7 years. It had been 7 years since the accident. 7 years since he'd watched the light fade from Evelyn's eyes on that rain-slicked highway. 7 years of visiting her grave at exactly 11:55 p.m. Because she'd always loved punctuality, always arrived at their dates 5 minutes early with that radiant smile that made his world stop turning. Daniel Morrison was 38 years old, though grief had aged him beyond his years. Silver streaked his dark hair now, and deep lines carved through his face like dried riverbeds. His neighbors in the quiet suburb of Willowbrook whispered when he left his house each night. Always at the same time, always carrying the same bouquet of white lilies. They said he was losing his mind. They said he needed help. They said a lot of things, but none of them understood. None of them heard what he heard. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been urging him for months to stop the nightly visits. Just last week, she leaned forward in her chair, her expression carefully neutral, professionally concerned. "Daniel, I need you to understand that this ritual isn't helping you heal. It's keeping you trapped in your grief." He'd stared at the floor, at the beige carpet with its neutral pattern designed to be inoffensive, forgettable. Everything in Dr. Chen's office was designed that way. Soft edges, muted colors, a space where pain was meant to be processed and packaged and put away. "You don't understand," he'd said quietly. "Then help me understand. She's still there." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Every night, right before midnight, I hear her. She whispers to me." Dr. Chen had written something in her notebook. "What does she say?" "Different things. Sometimes she tells me about her day like she used to. Sometimes she just says my name. But she's there, Dr. Chen. She's waiting for me." "Daniel, what you're experiencing is a manifestation of, I know what you think it is," he'd interrupted, standing abruptly. "I know you think I'm hallucinating, that my grief is creating auditory illusions, but I'm not crazy. I know what I hear." He'd walked out before she could respond, and he hadn't been back since. What was the point? No one believed him. No one wanted to believe that death wasn't always final, that sometimes the boundary between here and there grew thin enough to breach. But Daniel knew better. He'd been documenting it all in a leather-bound journal he kept locked in his nightstand drawer. Every visit, every whisper, every strange occurrence, page after page of careful notes, timestamps, descriptions of Evelyn's voice, the things she said that only she could know. Like how she'd remind him to take his blood pressure medication, even though she died before he was diagnosed with hypertension. Or how she'd commented on the new coffee shop on Cedar Street, the one that opened just 6 months ago. Sometimes the whispers felt so real, so present, that Daniel would turn expecting to see her standing behind him, that familiar smile playing at her lips. Tonight had been different, though. Tonight, everything had changed. Daniel had arrived at Evergreen Cemetery at his usual time, parking his aging Toyota Camry in the small lot near the entrance. The rain had started an hour earlier, steady and cold, turning the gravel paths to mud. He'd picked his way carefully between the headstones, white lilies clutched in one hand, flashlight in the other. Evelyn's grave sat beneath a large oak tree in the eastern section of the cemetery, plot number 247. Daniel knew every step of the journey by heart. 43 paces from the parking lot. Turn left at the angel statue with the broken wing. 17 more paces past the Henderson family plot. Then right at the marble cross, marking the Whitaker grave. But when he'd arrived at Evelyn's resting place, something was wrong. The grave looked disturbed. The soil was uneven, piled higher in some places, sunken in others. The flowers he'd left just 24 hours earlier were gone, not blown away by wind, but completely vanished. And there, in the center of the grave, was a depression in the earth, as if something had pressed up from below. Daniel had stood frozen, rain soaking through his jacket, staring at the impossible sight. Then he noticed the tombstone. Under the beam of his flashlight, the inscription had seemed to shimmer, the letters rearranging themselves. Evelyn Claire Morrison became Daniel Thomas Morrison. The beloved wife became the beloved husband. The dates flickered, 1983-2018, his birth year. The year of the accident. Lightning had split the sky, illuminating the cemetery in harsh white light, and in that moment Daniel had seen the inscription return to normal. Just a trick of the storm, he'd told himself. Just shadows and rain and his exhausted mind playing games. Then came the knocking. 3 deliberate raps from beneath the soil. Then Evelyn's voice, muffled and desperate, calling his name, begging him not to leave her in the cold and the dark. He'd run home in a panic, his heart hammering, his mind reeling. He'd paced his empty house for an hour, trying to make sense of what he'd heard, what he'd seen. Finally, he'd made a decision. He'd grabbed the old garden shovel from the garage, thrown it in the trunk of his car, and driven back to the cemetery. Now here he was on his knees in the mud, staring at the grave and trying to find the courage to do what every rational part of his brain screamed was impossible. Insane. "I'm going to get you out," he said aloud, reaching for the shovel. "I promise, Evelyn. I'm going to... You shouldn't be here." Daniel whirled around. A man stood 10 feet away, partially obscured by the darkness and rain. Tall, gaunt, wearing a groundskeeper's uniform that had seen better days. Mr. Holbrook, the cemetery caretaker. Daniel had seen him before, usually from a distance, always watching from the maintenance shed with an expression that was hard to read. "I have to," Daniel said, gripping the shovel tighter. "You don't understand. She's down there. She's calling for me." Holbrook stepped closer, and in the beam of Daniel's dropped flashlight, his face looked hollowed out, almost skull-like. He was older than Daniel had realized, maybe 70, with skin like weathered parchment and eyes that held something Daniel couldn't quite name. Sorrow, maybe, or warning. "I understand better than you think," Holbrook said quietly. "But you come here at 11:55 again. Dig where you're thinking of digging, and you'll unearth more than you buried, son." "What does that mean?" Daniel demanded. "What are you talking about?" Holbrook looked down at Evelyn's grave, then back at Daniel. "Some things should stay buried. Some doors shouldn't be opened. She's my wife. She was your wife. Past tense. You need to accept that and move on before..." Holbrook stopped abruptly, his gaze shifting to the church tower. The bell had fallen silent. "It's midnight. You need to leave, now. I'm not going anywhere until you will leave, or I'll call the police and have you arrested for attempted vandalism of a burial site." Holbrook's voice hardened. "Go home, Mr. Morrison. Grieve like a normal person. Stop coming here every night. It's not healthy and it's not safe." "Not safe?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "What's going to happen? Is the cemetery going to swallow me up?" Holbrook's expression didn't change. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what will happen. If you're not careful." They stared at each other in the rain, two men standing in a field of the dead, both holding secrets they couldn't quite articulate. Finally, Daniel picked up his shovel and turned away. "Fine, I'll go, but I'm coming back." "I know you will," Holbrook said softly. "They always do." Daniel didn't ask what he meant. He walked back to his car, threw the shovel in the trunk, and drove home through empty streets slick with rain. His house, a small two-bedroom Craftsman on Maple Avenue, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. He and Evelyn had bought it together, full of plans and dreams and discussions about paint colors and furniture placement. Now it was just a place where Daniel existed between visits to the cemetery. He stripped off his wet clothes and stood in the shower until the hot water ran cold. Then he put on sweatpants and a faded college t-shirt and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. The rational thing to do would be to call Dr. Chen, to schedule an emergency session, to admit that maybe everyone was right, and he was spiraling into some kind of breakdown. Instead, he opened his voice recorder app and scrolled through his recent recordings. He kept his phone on during cemetery visits, hoping to capture evidence of Evelyn's whispers. Most recordings were just wind and rain, and his own breathing. But tonight's recording, Daniel pressed play with trembling fingers. Static hissed through the phone's speakers. Rain drummed. His own voice echoed, "Evelyn, if you can hear me, please say something. Give me a sign." More static. Then, faint but unmistakable, a woman's voice. "Daniel, I'm so cold. Why won't you help me?" His breath caught. It was her, Evelyn's voice, exactly as he remembered it. Soft and melodic with that slight rasp she got when she was tired or emotional. "Baby, I'm here," his recorded self said. "Tell me what to do." The recording crackled. When Evelyn's voice came again, it had changed. Lower, harder. "You didn't save me, Daniel. You just watched me die. You sat there in the driver's seat and you watched the life drain out of me and you did nothing." Daniel fumbled with the phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He stabbed the stop button, but Evelyn's voice continued, growing louder, more distorted. "You killed me, Daniel. You killed us both. And now we're both trapped here, waiting. Always waiting for midnight that never comes." He hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a crack and clattered to the floor, the screen spiderwebbed with fractures. But the voice had stopped. Daniel buried his face in his hands, his whole body trembling. The whispers, the grave, Holbrook's warning. Now this recording that said things Evelyn would never say. Things that cut straight to the heart of his guilt. The argument. He'd almost forgotten about it. Had pushed it down so deep that it lived in the dark corners of his memory, where he never allowed himself to look. But now it came flooding back with perfect, terrible clarity. They'd been arguing that night, about something stupid, something that shouldn't have mattered. Daniel had been working late again, missing dinners, canceling plans. Evelyn had finally confronted him about it as they drove home from her mother's house. "You're never present anymore," she'd said, her voice tight with frustration. "Even when you're there, you're not really there. Your mind is always somewhere else. I'm trying to make a partner, Ev. You know how important this is. More important than us?" He'd taken his eyes off the road to look at her, to argue back, to defend himself. Just for a second, maybe two. When he'd looked back, the truck was already crossing into their lane, its headlights blinding, and there wasn't enough time to swerve. The impact had been catastrophic. Daniel remembered the sound of twisting metal, breaking glass, Evelyn's scream cut short. He remembered coming to the wreckage, his seatbelt holding him in place, blood streaming down his face. And he remembered turning his head, seeing Evelyn slumped against her door, her eyes open but unseeing, her mouth forming words that no longer had breath behind them. He'd reach for her, screaming her name, but his arm wouldn't respond. He just sat there, trapped and helpless, watching his wife die while rain poured through the shattered windshield. The paramedics had to cut him free. By then, Evelyn was gone. Daniel stood abruptly from the bed, unable to bear the weight of the memory. He walked to the window and stared out at the dark street. A part of him had died that night too. The part that believed he deserved happiness, deserved peace. That's why he visited the grave. Not just to remember Evelyn, but to punish himself, to stand in the rain and cold and feel even a fraction of what she'd felt in those final moments. But if she really was calling to him, if some part of her consciousness remained trapped between life and death, then maybe he could save her now. Maybe he could finally do what he'd failed to do 7 years ago. The next evening, Daniel returned to Evergreen Cemetery. He'd spent the day researching, digging through old newspaper archives and local history websites. What he'd found disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Evergreen Cemetery had a history, one that went back over 150 years. And according to several obscure sources, it had a reputation. There were stories of lights seen hovering over graves at night, reports of voices heard after dark, multiple accounts of groundskeepers refusing to work past 11 p.m. One article from 1973 mentioned a man who'd been found dead beside his mother's grave, frozen solid despite it being July. No cause of death was ever determined. Daniel had also found references to something called the 5-minute window, though details were scarce. One blog post by a local paranormal enthusiast claimed that the cemetery was built on land once used for executions, and that the condemned were buried at midnight to prevent their souls from finding rest. The blogger theorized that this had created a thin place, where the boundary between life and death grew permeable for exactly 5 minutes each night, from 11:55 p.m. to midnight. Daniel arrived at the cemetery gates just before 11. This time he was prepared. He had his shovel, a heavy-duty flashlight, work gloves, and a flask of coffee to ward off the cold. The sky was clear tonight, stars visible between gaps in the clouds. The moon a thin crescent that provided almost no light. He made his way to Evelyn's grave, his footsteps crunching on gravel. The cemetery was silent except for the wind rustling through trees and the distant hoot of an owl. When he reached plot 247, he stopped. Someone had been here. Fresh flowers lay across the grave, white lilies just like the ones Daniel always brought. But he hadn't been here today. He knelt and picked up one of the flowers, examining it in his flashlight beam. The stem was still green, the petals perfect and dewy. "I left those this morning," a voice said behind him. Daniel spun around. Mr. Holbrook stood a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his worn jacket. In the darkness, he looked even older, more haggard. "Why?" Daniel asked. "Same reason you do. To remember, to honor, to hold on to something that's already gone." Holbrook walked closer, his boots scuffing against stone markers. "I tried to warn you last night. I hoped you'd listen, that you'd be smarter than the others." "What others?" Holbrook sighed and sat down on a nearby bench, the wood creaking under his weight. "Sit down, Mr. Morrison. If you're determined to dig, at least understand what you're digging into." Daniel hesitated, then joined him on the bench. Up close, he could see that Holbrook's eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly. The man looked exhausted, worn down by something beyond mere physical labor. "I've been the caretaker here for 42 years, Holbrook began. "Took over from my father, who took over from his father. It's been in my family since the cemetery opened in 1871. And in all that time, every single member of my family learned the same lesson. Evergreen isn't like other cemeteries. It's cursed." "Cursed," Daniel repeated flatly. "I know how it sounds. I spent years denying it too. But the evidence is impossible to ignore." Holbrook pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one with shaking hands. "This place was built on execution grounds. Back in the 1800s, criminals were hanged here at midnight, and their bodies were buried immediately after. No ceremony, no prayers, just a hole in the ground and a shovel of dirt. What does that have to do with everything?" Holbrook took a long drag. "Those executions created something. A resonance, my father called it. Death that happens at midnight, at the exact turning point between days, doesn't process correctly. The soul gets stuck, caught between one state and another. And any burial that takes place at midnight suffers the same fate." Daniel's throat tightened. "Evelyn's funeral started at 11:45 p.m. I remember because I was here, making sure everything was ready. But there were delays. The priest was late. The pallbearers had trouble with the casket. By the time they lowered her into the ground, it was 5 minutes past midnight. Holbrook looked at Daniel with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry. I tried to warn the funeral director, but he thought I was just a crazy old man." "So you're saying Evelyn's soul is trapped? That she's been stuck here for 7 years?" "I'm saying it's more complicated than that." Holbrook flicked ash onto the ground. "The 5-minute window isn't just about trapped souls. It's about the boundary itself growing thin. Between 11:55 and midnight, things can cross over that shouldn't be able to. And people who are too close to that boundary, who stand in the cemetery during those minutes, they can get pulled through. Pulled through to where? To the in-between. The space where the trapped souls exist. Some people call it purgatory. Some call it the veil. I just call it the cemetery's hunger." Holbrook stood up, dropping his cigarette and grinding it out with his heel. "That's what happened to my wife, Mr. Morrison. 20 years ago, she came here looking for me through the window. She stepped onto the wrong grave at the wrong time, and the ground just swallowed her. Found her body the next morning, stone cold, eyes wide open, frozen in a scream. Daniel felt ice water trickle down his spine. If the cemetery is so dangerous, why do you stay? Because someone has to keep watch. Someone has to warn people away during the window, trying to prevent what happened to Helen from happening to others." Holbrook's voice cracked slightly. "And because I can still hear her sometimes. When I stood by her grave at 11:55, she calls to me just like your Evelyn calls to you." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Daniel asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd arrived. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not before?" "Because I saw your recording equipment last night. I know you've been documenting the voices. And I know that desperation in your eyes. You're going to dig no matter what I say." Holbrook pulled a small leather pouch from his jacket and handed it to Daniel. "So if you're going to do this, at least take precautions. Salt. Iron filings, sage, old protections, but they work. Scatter them around the grave before you dig. And whatever you do, be gone before midnight. Once the clock strikes 12, the window closes and anything on the wrong side gets trapped until the next night." Daniel took the pouch, feeling the grainy contents shift inside. "What if I can free her? What if I can bring her back?" "You can't bring back the dead, son. That's not how this works. The best you can hope for is to give her peace, to help her cross over properly." Holbrook put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "But I have to tell you the truth. Most people who try this don't survive. The cemetery doesn't like being defied. It takes what it wants, when it wants. I have to try. I know." Holbrook squeezed his shoulder once, then walked away. "Good luck, Mr. Morrison. I'll be in the maintenance shed if you need help, but I won't come out after 11:55. That's my line, and I've never crossed it since Helen died." Daniel watched him disappear into the darkness. Then he checked his watch, 11:42 p.m. 13 minutes until the window opened. He opened the leather pouch and began scattering salt around Evelyn's grave in a careful circle, then added the iron filings and crumbled sage leaves. The ritual felt absurd, like something from a movie, but he forced himself to complete it. At 11:53, he picked up his shovel and positioned himself at the head of the grave. The night had grown unnaturally still. No wind, no animal sounds. Even the distant traffic noise from the highway seemed to have faded to nothing. 11:54. The temperature dropped sharply. Daniel could see his breath now. White clouds puffing from his lips. His hands ached where they gripped the shovel. 11:55. The church bell didn't ring, but Daniel felt the shift anyway. It was like pressure building in his ears, like descending in an airplane. The air grew thick, almost liquid. And then he heard it. A chorus of whispers rising from the ground around him. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once, in a language that might have been English but sounded wrong, distorted. "Daniel." Her voice cut through the chaos, clear and close and unmistakably Evelyn's. "I'm here." He drove the shovel into the earth. "Hold on." He dug frantically, throwing soil aside in heaping piles. The earth was soft, almost loose, as if it wanted to be moved. Within minutes, he'd created a depression 2 feet deep. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. His arms burned with exertion. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just sounds anymore. Daniel could feel them brushing against his skin like invisible hands, pulling at his clothes, his hair. Something cold wrapped around his ankle and tugged. He kicked it away and kept digging. 3 feet down, 4 feet. The hole widened as he worked, his shovel striking earth in a steady rhythm. Any moment now, he'd hit the casket. Any moment, he'd reach Evelyn. Faster, Daniel, please, it's so cold and dark, I've been waiting so long. Almost there. The shovel hit something solid. Wood. Daniel dropped to his knees and began clearing soil away with his hands, revealing the curved top of a coffin. It was intact, sealed, exactly as it should be after 7 years in the ground. But something was wrong. The whispers had stopped. The cold pressure in the air had intensified, and Evelyn's voice, when it came again, sounded different. Layered, multiple voices speaking in unison. It's not me you're saving, Daniel. He froze, his hands buried in cold earth. What? Look at the nameplate. Read what it says. With trembling fingers, Daniel brushed more dirt away, revealing a tarnished brass nameplate attached to the coffin's lid. He aimed his flashlight at it, and his blood turned to ice. Daniel Thomas Morrison, beloved husband, 1983-2018. No, he whispered. No, that's not right. This is Evelyn's grave. I watched them lower her coffin. I stood right here. You stood right here, the voices agreed. You stood right here 7 years ago and you never left. The coffin lid cracked, not breaking open but splitting along invisible seams. Pale light leaked through the gaps, and with it came a smell like old flowers and stagnant water. Daniel scrambled backward, but his feet slipped in the loose soil and he fell, landing hard on his back. The coffin opened fully. Inside, illuminated by that ghostly light, was a body. His body. Daniel saw his own face, bloated and gray, eyes sunken but open, mouth twisted in a permanent scream. The corpse wore the same suit he'd worn to Evelyn's funeral, the same tie, the same shoes. And then the memories came flooding back, not as fragments, but as a complete, horrifying truth. The accident. Evelyn died in the passenger seat. The paramedics cut him free. But they hadn't saved him. He'd seen one of them check his pulse, shake his head, pull a sheet over him. Daniel had watched from above as they loaded 2 body bags into the ambulance. 2 bodies, his and Evelyn's. The funeral had been a double ceremony. They'd been buried side by side. But Daniel had never accepted it. Some part of his consciousness had clung to the cemetery, trapped in the 5-minute window, reliving the same ritual night after night, visiting what he thought was Evelyn's grave, but was actually his own. You died in the crash, Evelyn's voice said. She was standing beside him now, though he couldn't remember seeing her appear. She looked exactly as she had in life, beautiful and whole, except her eyes were wrong. They reflected no light. We both died, Daniel, but you wouldn't let go. You couldn't accept it. So you've been stuck here at this moment, visiting me every night at 11:55. Except it's not really me. It's your guilt taking my shape. Daniel looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. I killed us. I took my eyes off the road. It's my fault. Yes. She didn't offer comfort or forgiveness. But that doesn't mean you have to stay trapped forever. You can let go now, cross over, be at peace. How? Evelyn extended her hand. Stop running from what happened. Accept it. Accept that we're both gone, and there's nothing left to save. Daniel stared at her hand. Behind her, he could see the cemetery extending in all directions, but it looked different now, translucent. He could see through the headstones to layers beneath, other versions of the cemetery from different times. He could see other figures like him, trapped souls visiting graves, locked in their own rituals of denial. He reached for Evelyn's hand. The moment their fingers touched, the world lurched. The coffin vanished. The hole in the ground vanished. Daniel found himself standing on solid earth beside 2 graves, his and Evelyn's, side by side, the stones marking their deaths on the same night. I'm sorry, he whispered, for everything, for the arguments, for not paying attention, for getting us killed. Evelyn's form began to fade, becoming translucent like the cemetery around them. But she smiled, and it was real, warm, the smile he remembered from better days. "I know, and I'm sorry too. For the things I said before the crash. For not telling you I loved you one more time." "I love you," Daniel said. "I'll always love you." "I know. That's why you have to let me go now. Let both of us go." The church bell began to toll. Midnight. The window was closing. Evelyn's form dissolved into mist, and with it, the translucent layers of the cemetery faded. Reality solidified around Daniel, becoming opaque and concrete and final. And then he felt himself dissolving too. Not painfully, but like releasing a breath he'd been holding for 7 years. His consciousness drifted upward, away from the cemetery, away from the graves and the grief and the guilt. In the last moment before he crossed over completely, he saw Mr. Holbrook standing by the maintenance shed, watching the cemetery with sad eyes. And he understood finally what the old man had been trying to tell him. Some of them did survive. They just didn't survive as themselves. Morning light filtered through the trees of Evergreen Cemetery. Mr. Holbrook made his rounds as he did every day, checking that nothing had been disturbed, that the graves remained peaceful. He stopped at plot 247 and its neighbor, plot 248. The Morrison graves. He knew them well by now. "Rest easy, son," he murmured, brushing some fallen leaves off Daniel's headstone. "You finally made it." A week later, Holbrook sat in his office reviewing security footage. The board of directors had requested documentation of the cemetery's nighttime activities after several reports of trespassing. He scrolled through the recordings from the previous month, noting the times and locations where he'd need to increase patrols. Then he reached the footage from the night Daniel Morrison had finally crossed over. Holbrook watched as the camera showed Daniel arriving at 11:42, scattering salt around the grave, beginning to dig. He watched the clock in the corner tick toward 11:55, but something made him pause the footage. Rewind it. Play it again, more slowly. There, in the background of the shot, standing 20 feet behind Daniel, a figure in a groundskeeper's uniform. Watching. Waiting. Holbrook leaned closer to the screen, his heart beginning to pound. The figure was tall, gaunt, wearing the same worn jacket Holbrook wore every day. The figure was him. He watched himself standing there in the recording, perfectly still, not moving, not breathing. Just watching Daniel dig. But Holbrook hadn't been there. He'd been in the maintenance shed. He'd specifically told Daniel he wouldn't come out after 11:55. He remembered sitting in his office, listening to the church bell toll midnight, waiting to see if Daniel would return, except Holbrook stood up so fast his chair tipped over. He grabbed his jacket, checking the pockets. The leather pouch was there. The one he'd given Daniel. The one he'd told Daniel contained salt and iron filings and sage, but he could feel the contents through the fabric. The pouch was still full. He'd never given it away. His hands shaking, Holbrook opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. His employment records. He flipped to the page showing his hire date. October 15th, 1983. 42 years ago, he'd said. But it is now 2025. That would make it 1983, the same year Daniel Morrison was born. The same year Helen, Holbrook's wife, had died. The same year Holbrook himself had died. He walked to the window and looked out at the cemetery, at the hundreds of headstones marking hundreds of graves. In the distance, he could see a figure walking between the plots. A woman in a white dress, visiting a grave. She'd be there until 11:55, when she'd hear whispers that would keep her returning night after night after night. The cemetery was hungry. It always has been. And it was very, very patient. Holbrook checked his watch. 11:54 p.m. 1 minute until the window opened again. 1 minute until another soul arrived at Evergreen Cemetery, drawn by grief or guilt or love or all three at once. 1 minute until the cycle continued. The church bell began to toll early. Once, twice. "Some doors between the living and the dead don't close," Holbrook whispered to his reflection in the window. "They just wait for 11:55. The bell continued its count. 3, 4, 5, and in the cemetery below, the ground began to shift. If you've been captivated by this haunting tale of grief, guilt, and the thin veil between life and death, then we'd love to hear from you. What did you think of Daniel's journey? Have you ever experienced something that made you question the boundary between our world and the next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding. And if this story sends chills down your spine, then you're going to want to make sure you never miss another tale. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we've got more spine-tingling stories coming your way. Each one more unsettling than the last. Each one exploring the darkest corners of the human experience. Share this video with someone who appreciates a good story, someone who understands that the scariest tales are the ones that feel like they could be true. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what lies beneath the ground. It's what lies within ourselves, waiting for the clock to strike 11:55.